Welcome to episode 33 of Posture Labs and Alignment Fundamentals. My name is Emma and I'm your host. Thank you so much for tuning into this series where we kind of go over basic alignment for most of the common yoga poses. This episode is going to cover everyone's favorite pose, Navasana or boat pose. I say that sarcastically because most people don't love this pose. It's pretty challenging on your core, but the core really is the foundation of your yoga practice. Maybe not the foundation of your practice, but your core is very important in your yoga practice to ensure that you're doing all the poses correctly and safely. It helps to keep you strong and engaged. So I do like this pose, maybe not when I'm in it for 10 breaths, but I do think it's very beneficial. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, I'll always give you options here. This pose isn't super, it's challenging, but there's not a lot to it. So really Navasana boat pose looks a little bit like this. Now, of course, there are different variations. And I'm not going to actually hold the pose the whole time while I talk through it because it's very challenging. But one thing I do like to mention is your spine. A lot of us have a tendency here to round our backs because we're engaging our core a lot. So we start to round especially the lumbar thoracic spine a little bit here. Now, instead of doing that, I want you to think about pushing your lower back in. So as you do that, you'll start to feel those lower abs around your hip flexors a little bit more. So instead of rounding like this, try to push your lower back in. As you do that, you kind of feel your heart space expand. Now, instead of craning your neck and looking up, I want you to keep a nice neutral spine. So almost pulling the chin back in towards the throat. Now, if the knees bent with the shins parallel to the mat is challenging for you, you can always stay here. If this is too much, I would recommend putting your hands behind you. So you, again, avoid rounding into your back. You can almost use your fingertips to help lift up through your heart. Still going to be super challenging, and you'll feel that on your hip flexors a lot. Now, if you would like to do the full pose, Navasana, you would straighten your legs. Now, of course, this is the most challenging, and here I really start to see the rounding in the back. So puff up your chest is what I like to say. Squeeze your inner thighs, push your low back in, pull your ribs down towards your hips, and plug your shoulders back. I like to gaze up at the toes, plug the chin back slightly, breathe, and release. Now, you should be kind of just below your tailbone. If you feel like it's really bony there, you could always double roll your mat or put a little towel underneath you. If that's a little bit too challenging, of course, go back to the knees bent or hands behind you. I like to point the toes here, but you could also do feet flexed. You'll still feel a lot of engagement through your core. There is also low boat pose. I don't really teach this one a lot, but basically the same thing. We go from high boat or regular boat down and lower our low back to the mat, keeping your legs floating and shoulder blades floating off the mat. I actually think this is a little bit more challenging because most of us tend to arch our lumbar spine a little bit, and so you'll feel that lift off of the mat. So the goal is to kind of keep your lower back on the mat, which can be very challenging here. So you're kind of just pulling your belly button down, trying to keep the entire lower spine on the mat, floating the legs with the legs straight. The lower you take your legs, the much harder it's going to get. The more you take your legs up, it's a little bit easier, but you're trying to keep those shoulder blades off the mat, gazes up so you're not crunching your neck. I don't think it's going to be super beneficial to see from the front, but I'll show you regardless. Same thing. I like to even start with the hands behind the hamstrings, parallel your shins with the mat, and then extend your arms forward. So you can't really see my spine here, but if I sit up a little taller, you might see my heart space lift slightly, legs straight, or fingertips behind me. Now, as I do this, I don't want to be dumping into my shoulders. I want to think nice straight spine. So it's not really even a modification. I guess it's a modification. It makes it slightly easier, but you're still feeling all of the work in your lower spine. This pose is a lot to hold, so I'd recommend starting maybe 3 breaths, then 5 breaths. Again, this is a great way to strengthen your core to do all the other poses correctly as well. After this pose, I would recommend stretching out your hip flexors, maybe a reverse plank or reverse tabletop, or even in a bridge pose. Any other back bend would also be great to kind of stretch out the front of your body after Navasana. If you have any questions regarding Navasana, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. If you have a different tip or tricks, ways to make it a little bit more bearable or more challenging, go ahead and let me know as well. I always like feedback. Thank you so much for watching episode 33, and I will see you back next Friday for episode 34.